in the White Album when John Lennon sang in Glass Onion, when he sang, "Here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul." What does he mean by another clue?
Well, we know, don't we, really? It was another link in the chain.
Yeah, it is. So, to make you look. And then finally, when Abbey Road came out, that's when the clues hit and everybody started going back. But you know my favorite clue? This is the one that I think the Beatles had to plant themselves in this. And I can't find any logical explanation to tell me that this was not put in by the Beatles. And it has to do with the Sgt. Pepper cover and the bass drum. And if you remember the bass drum, Peter Blake designed the entire cover, but the bass drum was supposedly given credit to a fairground painter from Australia whose name was Joe Epgrave. Now you take Ep and grave, it sounds almost like epitaph and grave, doesn't it? And when you look at the freshly dug dirt with the Beatles and red hyacinth flowers, and which is another symbol, but the Beatles are standing above it, McCartney behind the bass drum with an open hand over his head, picking him out from the crowd. Life magazine even did an article saying that the open hand was a far eastern symbol of death, or the idea of benediction when a body is placed into the grave. And I thought, well, boy, that's a stretch. But here's the thing. He's picked out of the crowd, and on the bass drum it says Sgt. Pepper's, and then in the center it says Lonely Hearts, completely different font, and then it says Club Band. So I was interested in why that font was so different. And then I did my research on Sgt. Pepper's and found that there were 2 bass drums designed, and the drums were different except for the phrase Lonely Hearts. So I remember looking into the crowd and seeing Lewis Carroll, who had written Alice's Adventures Through the Looking Glass, and I had heard that if you use mirrors, you could find clues on Beatle albums. So, from Magical Mystery Tour, the phone number that supposedly appeared. So I took a straight edge mirror, put it in the center of Lonely Hearts, and reading from the glass reflection to the album cover, it spells out a cryptic message. It starts with numeral 1, and then it spells O-N-E, which is 1 again. Then it has numeral I-X, which is 9. And then, this is what sent the chill up my spine.
Okay. The
next phrase is, he die. And between he and die is a diamond-shaped arrow pointing straight up to Paul McCartney and down to the grave. And you take a look at 119, at first, Great Britain, that would be September 11th, right? Which is sort of...
significant number anyway, yeah.
Yes, for today, but when I did my research, I found in a couple of Beatle books, they'd mentioned a car accident Paul McCartney had on November 9th, which was November 9th, 1966, which fit the exact date. And the accident supposedly occurred at 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, when you turn the album cover over, it was the first cover that lyrics were ever printed on an album jacket. And George Harrison is standing there, and he's pointing, and the line that's superimposed to his finger is the first line from She's Leaving Home, which says, Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock. The exact day and hour on November 9th, 1966.
But like 9/11, like the death of Diana, like the killing of JFK, decades and decades on, people will still be talking about and debating these things, and there will be no definitive answer as to whether all this was planned or whether it's just furtive, whether it's just overactive, hyperactive imaginations at work.
It could be that, but I always tell people that if Paul McCartney had died in 1966, imagine the songs we wouldn't have, because
that's true.
Live and Let Die, the whole second side of Abbey Road. So if this guy's an imposter that some people actually believe, he had to be pretty talented, didn't he?
I think he probably did. You know what? The only thing I regret now is that when I met him a few years ago, and we had a chance to talk, and we talked, he's a very, very ordinary guy, He is just like an ordinary Joe on the street. I was so impressed with him, and he gives his attention completely to you, but I wish I'd asked him about all of this.
I have to tell you, I had a friend who works with ABC Radio, and when the Beatles anthology came out, he interviewed McCartney. And my friend is the guy who wrote the foreword to my book, The Walrus Was Paul. And he sent me a tape. He said, Gary, you got to hear this. So he sent me a tape of the interview, and he was asking about the song Free as a Bird. And I'm sure you remember that when the Beatles put it out, there are like 90 Beatle clues in that video. And my friend asked Paul about the clues, and Paul said, well, and this is his words, he said, well, it became a bit of a game in the old Beatle days to put little hidden things in. And it sort of implies that they put hidden things in their songs, and he was talking about it. So, other little hidden ideas. I mean, obviously they sold a lot of records when the Paul is Dead records went out, because all the Beatles vinyl jumped back on the Billboard charts for people buying them, looking for clues, and wearing them out, playing them backwards. So if it was a great game, that was wonderful. And it was Charles Manson murders.
Good for business.
Yeah, it's great for business, but if Charlie Manson was hearing things in Helter Skelter that started a series of murders, it would be better to keep your mouth shut and not say anything about being planted that would have to do with affecting people's mental states if they listen to things backwards. So I think they got scared. If they had actually planted some things, why would they want to be involved in this Manson mess? So, you know, it was a great story. Kids still love it. And by the way, the 40th anniversary of all this, I can't believe it, is coming up, you know, on this, let's see, October is when the Clues came out, October 12th. So 40 years ago to the day, we start in October.
Wow, where did that time go? Of course, you got Paul's last album, he called Memory Almost Full, and he has a song in there looking back at all his, what's the song called, My Ever-Present Past, where he's kind of harking back to all of that stuff. It is fascinating. Do you think that the Beatles' involvement with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and the discovery of LSD and other substances that bend the mind, do you think that that opened any doors or portals to them?
Well, you know, I think that they were very much more creative. And, you know, when I talk about this, we talk about LSD. You got to remember that when LSD first came out, it wasn't illegal for a year. So a lot of people were doing it, and started in San Francisco, but, you know, it wasn't necessarily illegal. And when the Beatles mentioned they'd taken LSD, then, you know, they lost a lot of audience because a lot of people were saying, oh, you know, these Beatles aren't the guys next door like Brian Epstein made them out to be. So, you know, I think a lot of musicians have always used some form of drug to help make them more relaxed or more creative. And normally you think of heroin with the old blues artist. And, well, with the Rolling Stones, for instance, you know, you have a story the same way. But I think that anything that opened their consciousness, I think that the idea of accepting Far Eastern religions was a way in which to find new truths, because everybody sort of went against their parents' generation.
Well, true enough. Gary, the one person, of course, took drugs and sex and rock and roll to its ultimate limits was Jim Morrison of The Doors. Exactly. And there are a zillion million theories about him, about how he died, about his interest in the occult before he died, and in fact now they're even saying that he may not have died at all.
Well, or the latest rumor, I was in Paris last summer, probably about a year ago, and I know that I left the day before Morrison's death celebration when he was buried there. I think it was the 2nd. The Doors were there on the 3rd. But the whole thing is that there's a new book that's only available in France saying that Morrison had died in a nightclub, and that, I think it was Electric Circus, and he had died in a bathroom stall, been given an overdose, and 2 men had said, no, he's not dead. They took him back to his apartment and put him in the bathtub to try to revive him. One of the strange things about the bathtub, and I know Alan Graham, who's Jim Morrison's brother-in-law, and of course Alan Graham is also from Liverpool. Did you know that?
I didn't. I do now.
And he was married to Jim Morrison's sister, Anna. But what's odd about Morrison's find in the bathtub is that his back was up against the faucets, which normally you would not get in a bathtub and put your back against the faucets, and which might mean that he was placed there. But you know, the story is that either Morrison had faked his death, because when he left L.A., he told the Doors that he could see himself just totally dropping out, putting on a 3-piece suit, shaving his beard, and getting out of this rock and roll industry. So when the word came to the Doors that Morrison had died, Ray Manzarek, the keyboardist, sent the Doors manager, Bill Siddons, to Paris, and he said, Bill, I don't want to be morbid, but make sure. So when Siddons came to Paris, all he saw was a simple wooden coffin, veneer coffin, with the lid screwed into place. He never saw the body. He went to the funeral, which I think was on July 8th, and I think there were only 6 people there. And when he came back, he said, well, I didn't see the body, I just saw the coffin. So nobody knows if Morrison was really in the coffin. I mean, I believe that Morrison died in Paris. I believe he's buried at Père Lachaise. But when he was buried, Pamela Courson only leased the grave. She didn't purchase it. So the grave was only leased for 30 years.
That's a strange thing, isn't it? Why would she do that?
Well, I don't know if it was a lack of funding, because after he died, the grave was unmarked for a number of months. No headstone. And he was just buried there, in a very strange place. It's in where a lot of the Holocaust victims were buried. It's not, next to Oscar Wilde or some of the others. Matter of fact, there was a strange parallel to Morrison and Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde had left England for being accused of sex crimes. He was a homosexual at the time they arrested people who were homosexuals. So he went to Paris, and Morrison had been convicted of his crime in Miami, a public exhibition or whatever. And if he'd come back to the United States, he would be put in jail. But see, France will not extradite for sex crimes. So that's the safe place for Morrison. And when he went to Paris, he stayed in the same hotel that Oscar Wilde had stayed in. And matter of fact, the room that Morrison had was the room that Oscar Wilde died in. And Oscar Wilde's last words were, either that wallpaper goes or I do. So the wallpaper stayed.
Wow. So it is possible, isn't it, to see parallels in a lot of these things. But one thing that comes to my mind, because you hear it so often with people who are in rock and roll particularly, and we're going back to the Beatles here, they almost predict their own fate. Remember that John Lennon did an interview and he said, he was talking about great peace campaigners, and he said so-and-so, and Gandhi, they all ended up getting shot.
Yeah.
Well, what happened to him?
Exactly, and I'll give you another one. When John Lennon did the Playboy interviews, he was talking, and all at once there was a gunshot. And Lennon turns to the interviewer and says, "Oh, another murder at the Rue Dakota." This was like 2 days before he died. And what's odd is John Lennon was the only person to that time, I'm not sure afterwards, who had ever been murdered at the Dakota. So that's chilling. And this was just a few days. When Nick Drake wrote the album 5 Leaves Left, when he did that album, there were only 5 albums left. He did 5 albums, 5 leaves left. And there's sort of like an idea of premonition. Buddy Holly's last song is, it doesn't matter anymore. Well, if you're killed in a plane crash, I guess it doesn't matter anymore. So a lot of the last bits of the songs and that run through it, it seems like it's a premonition of bad things to come.
But it is quite often the case that sometimes people know without actually consciously knowing what's coming to them, and in a way there are people who will also claim that they've created that future for themselves without even knowing it. There are people who say all of this works on a level that's way above and beyond any of us.
Well, maybe there's some mathematical progression of the universe that puts it all in. I mean, like John Lennon was fascinated with the number 9, okay? Even when he was in Liverpool. I believe Liverpool has 9 letters too. But his bust, everything has to do with the number 9. The date he was born, you add it together, it comes to the number 9. But the thing that always got me was that when he was killed on December 8th, and he was officially pronounced dead at, what was it? Anyway, it was 11, you add it together, it came out to 9. He died on 9th Avenue, and Roosevelt Hospital was 9 letters. And if you think about the moment he died after 11 p.m. Eastern Time, it would have been December 9th in Liverpool, wouldn't it? Because he was a British citizen. And he had the fascination with the 9 and numerology that governed his life. He believed in that. I mean, he was into it. So what better way to predict it? I mean, whether it was brought on by energy or brought on by metaphysical pursuits or whatever, it is still shocking.
Well, if you believe some people, large events, big, impactful events like 9/11 or the killing of John Lennon, which was, of course, reported around the world and created shockwaves with all of us in Liverpool. I was actually a trainee journalist, and I actually told Liverpool that news that day, so it made an impact on me. But there are people who say that huge events like that almost send out ripples through time that come back to you. In other words, the people who are involved in those things are hit by the ripples through time. The event happens, it's happened in the future, but the ripples from it, the backwash from it, comes back to you and hits you.
Well, I can see that. I mean, these are powerful, moving things that have touched generations, and in a way that a lot of people probably don't understand. Like, for instance, when John Kennedy was assassinated, I was in junior high school, and I felt a sense of loss. But when John Lennon was murdered, it was 100 times worse for me. And a lot of people would say, well, he was a musician. He wasn't an American president. I mean, what's the big deal? But the thing is, I felt like I grew up with John Lennon. I thought, even though I've never met the man, his music had a lot of impact on me. This music still is being created. New generations are hearing it. Kids grow up, they hear it. They become devastated by the loss.
You're absolutely right. It affects all of you, I think, everybody who's interested in music in a way that almost a family bereavement would. For us in Liverpool at that time, it was, you heard the news. I remember being in the bathroom getting ready to go out to work, and it was probably 4:30 in the morning in Liverpool that day. and I couldn't believe what I'd heard. I'd heard the words and I knew what the story was, but I still could not compute that that could happen.
No, and nor could I. And I was stunned for a week afterwards before I could accept anything. And I really couldn't even listen to any Beatle music for a week because I became very depressed just listening to it. So I think that was the thing that sort of bothered me, was just the idea that, it was senseless and there was no explanation for it. But, sometimes the bullet of a madman has done more to change anything in history than anything else.
True enough. And what about Mark Chapman? What's the latest on him?
Well, I understand.
He's been trying to get out, hasn't he?
He's trying to get out. It's kind of interesting. It seems like in the United States, when you have a lot of people who commit a murder like this, they usually become very religious, and they tell you that they're no longer a threat to society. But I don't think that Chapman will ever be released, and that's really sad. I know I've spoken at a Beatle convention in Atlanta, Georgia, and two fellows came up and they were talking to me, and they were really depressed because it was during the Beatles anthology, and they said, we were the guys who turned Mark David Chapman onto the Beatles. We were the ones who gave him his first albums and really created this love.
So in a way they felt responsible, did they?
They did.
Wow.
Why didn't we do something else, And it was just, everybody took some sort of responsibility. If only I had, maybe John Lennon would still be alive.
It's funny how that happens, isn't it? In practice, we know that there's nothing really that they could have done, and they're not at all responsible for it, but I guess in their heads they're always going to feel slightly so.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what a large consciousness is with the music of John Lennon, that, everybody thought, why could this happen? How, if I hadn't been involved? And even though it's not their fault, like you say, it's just a sense of loss that's taken by everyone.
Let's get to the really spooky stuff now, and you mentioned Buddy Holly, and I know that lately you've done a lot of work to do with Buddy Holly and Peggy Sue.
Well, I tell you, the thing that's real interesting, and what we'll do, Howard, is Peggy Sue's a very good friend of mine, and
so
we should
hang
have
on,
her on your show.
Well, yeah, let's do that. On a future show, I want to get Peggy Sue on, but the song Peggy Sue is a massive international hit. Everybody knows that song. Most of us, including me, until recently, until I started reading some of the stuff that you were writing about this, didn't believe that Peggy Sue was a real person. We just thought it was a figment of his imagination.
Well, it's much more than a real person. If you read Peggy Sue's new book, Whatever Happened to Peggy Sue, she tells you the whole story. The song was written in honor of Peggy Sue, and of course Peggy Sue Guerin is her name, but she was married to Jerry Allison of the Crickets, the drummer. And the story goes that Jerry is the one who asked Buddy to write the song, but Buddy had an infatuation with Peggy Sue. His apartment tapes before his plane crash, he had written a song called Peggy Sue Got Married. And Peggy Sue has a very, very personal relationship with Buddy Holly that she'd be glad to talk about. I don't think I could do that justice, but let me tell you the spooky stuff. When Buddy Holly was killed with Ritchie Valens and the Big Bopper, everybody who took his place, strange things happened in the Crickets. Ronnie Smith took his place, finished the tour. As soon as the tour was over, he checked himself into a hospital because he was an alcoholic and he had, I guess we'd call them rehabs today, but not back then. And he hangs himself in the hospital. The next person to play in the Crickets was David Box. He was like 17 years old, and he actually recorded the song Peggy Sue Got Married. Everybody thinks it's Buddy Holly, but it's actually David Box. After a few years playing with the Crickets, he leaves the Crickets, starts a solo career, charters a small plane in Houston, Texas, and he and two members of his band are killed in a plane crash. He was 22 years old when he died, just like Buddy Holly.
Wow.
When the song, remember the song I Fought the Law and the Law Won?
Yeah.
That was written by Sonny Curtis, who was the guitarist in the Crickets. Well, in Texas, you had a very famous guitarist, Bobby Fuller, who had sent his tapes, demo tapes, to Buddy Holly's mother and father. Buddy Holly's mother and father took the tapes and sent them to Norman Petty, who was the producer and engineer for all of Buddy Holly's recordings in Clovis, New Mexico. Bobby Fuller recorded with Petty, left, moved to Hollywood, recorded with Bob Keane in Delphi Records, and the last song he cut, the song that made him famous was I Fought the Law and the Law Won, but he cut also a song called Love's Made a Fool of You. It was the last song recorded, a song written by Buddy Holly. They found his body in his mother's car. He'd been beaten, he was doused with gasoline, he had gasoline in his stomach, and the Hollywood police announced that it was a suicide. Now the problem is, you cannot drink gasoline and live. It had to be put after you were dead.
And also there's a very obvious problem with that. You can't exactly beat yourself up, can you?
You can't beat yourself badly and then try to swallow gasoline. So whatever happened to his death, he was 22 when he died, just like Buddy Holly. And the story goes on, even Keith Moon died on Buddy Holly's birthday, September 7th.
So what was it, if we follow this line of thinking and we don't just say, well, that's all coincidence, and there will be people who email me and say exactly that. If we don't say it's all coincidence, what is the factor? What's going on, I guess, is what we want to say.
Well, I think it's be careful what you wish for. I mean, Buddy Holly inspired a lot of people's dreams to be a rock star. And Buddy Holly decided to leave country music when he saw Elvis perform. So, he was the guy who really created American rock and roll. I mean, the Beatles, the very first song the Beatles ever recorded on a borrowed tape deck was That'll Be the Day.
So you're saying, and I think there is some mileage in this idea, that a lot of people thought, I would like to be Buddy Holly. And as you say, if you wish for a thing, it comes to you, but perhaps it can come to you literally.
And that's the thing. I mean, for instance, when Keith Moon died, he had gone out with Paul McCartney the night before to watch the Buddy Holly story in the London West End, the play. So the last thing he saw was the Buddy Holly story on September 6th. He's dead on September 7th, which just happens to be Buddy Holly's birthday. And Tupac Shakur was shot on September 7th. And, I mean, you take a look at the date, September 7th, you take a look at the people who were close. Del Shannon, who did Runaway, had performed on the anniversary of Buddy Holly's death. I think it was something like the 30th or 40th anniversary. And a few days later, I think it was on February 9th, he kills himself. And the last show he did was with the Crickets. And when you take a look at Buddy Holly's best friend, Eddie Cochran, who is very well known in Great Britain, more so than the United States.
True enough.
He was supposed to be with Buddy Holly on that winter dance party. And it haunted him that he knew that if he had been there, he would have been on that plane. So he felt like death was stalking him. And when he went on his tour of Great Britain, his girlfriend Shannon Shealy was there. He has her go out and buy all these Buddy Holly singles. And he would sit in his hotel room and listen to the records with the lights out. And Sharon Shealy came in, she said, Eddie, you got to get over this. And he looked at her and he says, no, because I think I'll be seeing Buddy soon.
Gee whiz.
He went to see a fortune teller to find out when his death was supposed to happen. He wakes up screaming, I'm going to die, and there's not anything anyone can do about it. So when he's killed in his tragic car crash with Gene Vincent, being injured, with his leg being injured again, a lot of people thought that maybe the record company had not Gene Vincent, but Eddie Cochran killed so they could make more money. Because Bob Keane, who owned Delphi Records, who Richie Valens recorded for, and Bobby Fuller, who both were killed, and of course Richie Valens with Buddy Holly in a plane crash. He also had Sam Cooke. All three of his major artists died mysterious deaths with insurance policies involved. So you take a look at that. You talk about conspiracy theories. Bob Keane was completely innocent. He was even investigated by the FBI. But, I mean, there's parallels that go in. So when we talk about be careful what you wish for, it goes back to that deserted country crossroads in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where the story goes that Robert Johnson had made a pact with the devil that, he would gain fame and he would make money and make his name live eternally, but that he would die a young death. And he died at 27. And you take a look at 16 major rock stars who died at 27. You're talking about Brian Jones, who died at 27, Jim Morrison died at 27, Jimi Hendrix died at 27, Janis Joplin died at 27, Kurt Cobain died at 27, Pete Ham from Badfinger died at 27. You go through the list. Now, 2 plus 7 makes 9, which John Lennon knew was the end number.
And so it takes us back to that number 9. That's astonishing. What about Buddy Holly himself? Was he connected? Did he do occult things? Was he interested in the paranormal? Did he have any connection here?
Well, not actually. I mean, I think I can't find anything. Peggy Sue may know because I've never sat and talked to her about it. But Buddy Holly was just, a guy who just enjoyed writing great rock and roll music. And, he'd even learned to fly a small plane. And Peggy Sue had a premonition of him dying in a plane crash, and she went to him at least 3 times to warn him not to be in a small plane. He said, I can coast this in. But the key thing is the 50th anniversary of Buddy Holly's plane crash that comes up on February 3rd this year is what happened in that plane. Why would it crash just 9 miles after takeoff? And the story goes that the pilot was in trained on his instruments, and he was going down instead of going up in the snowstorm. But there's evidence to say that the weather wasn't that bad when they took off. And why didn't the plane crash and catch on fire? I mean, how many plane crashes occur with no flame? And that was it. And then why was the Big Bopper's body thrown 40 feet in front of the plane and the others too? I talked to the Big Bopper's son, JP. And Jay told me that he had his father, well, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but they actually had the Big Bopper body removed and an autopsy was performed last year. Are you familiar with this?
I've kind of heard that story, but tell it again.
Okay, so his son, who was born 3 months after his father's death, had never seen his father, never heard from him, nothing. He was always obsessed with his dad. So the body farm in Knoxville, Tennessee, Dr. Bass, probably one of the world's leading forensic scientists, was hired to do an autopsy of the Big Bopper. Now, what bothered his son was why was the Big Bopper's body 40 feet in front of the plane and everyone else next to the plane? He was afraid that his father may have survived initially and was trying to crawl through that field to get help. And it haunted him. So the autopsy, it just really said that his father died instantly, and probably the impact. I mean, who knows what happened? When that plane took off, was Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper trying to exchange seats in the plane to throw off the weight? Is that why the Big Bopper was thrown in front of the plane? But all of this has happened, and there's all kinds of great investigations. The plane, by the way, we know is in a hangar. So there's a hope that the plane might go through another forensics investigation to find out what happened.
This many years on, the plane is still in existence, and if somebody did want to do a full forensic 2008-style examination, they could, to finally get a handle on why this happened.
That's right. And who knows? It's 50 years, so maybe the owner might allow that to happen. And there were stories that a gun was on the plane, and that the gunshot may have gone through the seat and killed the pilot. That's why the plane crashed. Because when they moved the plane, they found Buddy Holly's handgun. That was in the spring, and the gun had been fired twice.
Could this be another case of, and this has happened in rock a few times, hasn't it, of somebody playing with a gun, like Terry Kath of Chicago was playing with a gun and put a bullet through his temple, didn't he?
Well, that's exactly it. And Johnny Ace, the first great rock and roll fatality, if you remember the story, he had the song called Pledging My Love. It was in like 1954, I think, and he was backstage at a club in Texas, and with Big Mama Thornton, and he had a handgun pointing it at everybody, pulling the trigger, and it was just clicking. He even pointed at his girlfriend's head. Big Mama Thornton grabbed the gun from his hand. He grabbed it back and said, "Look, this gun's not loaded." He put it to his head, pulled the trigger, the gun went off, and he booked his ticket to rock and roll heaven that very moment. But
what is this relationship between rockers and guns? Look at Phil Spector, who apparently always had a gun in the house. And when Lennon was going there to work with him, he said we couldn't stay around. Well, him and McCartney said we couldn't stay around this guy for too long. He was just a little too worrying with the guns.
Well, if you remember, when Lennon was recording with him, Spector fired the gun in the studio up into the ceiling. And John Lennon said, "Phil, if you want to shoot me, but don't blow out my ears." He said, "That's how I make my living." And Dee Dee Ramone said, when Spector was working with the Ramones, that he became so infuriated with the band, he told them that he stood in front of them, took out his pistol, and he said, "The first one who messes up, I'm going to shoot you." And they were playing, and he was pointing the gun at each one of them as they were playing.
Gee, I've had a few bosses like that.
Yeah, well, Joe Meek.
Joe Meek. Now,
guns.
I wanted to get right. You know that I'm not an aficionado, but I am a fan of Joe Meek's music and the work that he did. For those who don't know, Joe Meek was the man behind, I suppose the most famous record that he was behind was Telstar. But he used to make records in a house on the Holloway Road in London. He would have people recording in the bathroom, in different parts of he had the whole place mic'd up. And the great thing about it is, in fact, at the moment, I am looking at a little green box that says Joe Meek on the front. He designed recording circuitry that people like me are still using to this day. In fact, I was determined to use my little Joe Meek box today while recording this. Now, Joe Meek was a genius, but he was also, mad's a heavy word. We don't know whether he was mad, but he had problems, and he was dabbling in the occult, wasn't he?
Oh, my goodness. And, yes. And we're going to bring this all full circle because it's a great story. When Joe Meek was born, I think he had an older brother. His mother wanted a daughter, so she dressed him like a girl until he went to school. So you can imagine how he was tormented by the other boys.
So he had an identity crisis from the start.
From the beginning. And, what makes him very significant, and we got to remember that, and Howard, you would know this, because in the late 50s, there was really no substitute for American rock and roll. A lot of British groups would take American songs like by the Supremes or by the girl bands, and they would record them and put them out in the UK before the American releases came over. So what Joe Meek did that was fascinating, he took the song Telstar by the Tornadoes, and it topped the charts in the United States. It was the first British single to be #1 in the United States. And that says a lot because, I mean, the song was so incredible. Of course, Joe Meek wrote the song, but he couldn't carry a tune. I mean, he did it piece by piece, and I mean, which was amazing. And of course, he got into the occult, and at first it was pretty innocent. He did a lot of tarot card readings, and one night he and 2 other friends were sitting around, and one was shuffling the cards, one turned the cards, and the other one wrote the prediction or what the card meant. And as they were playing, they came up with this message. It said, Buddy Holly dies February 3rd.
Wow.
Now, Buddy Holly and the Crickets came to England in March of 1958. So Joe Meek had tried to get in touch with Buddy Holly because he was a major Buddy Holly fan. He worshipped Buddy Holly. And when Buddy Holly came to Great Britain, Joe Meek met him. He said, look, this may sound crazy, but I was playing tarot cards, and it said you need to be very careful on February 3rd. I'm so glad that this is March. And he said, you're going to have to promise me that on February 3rd you'll be very careful because it said you'll die on February 3rd. When Buddy Holly came back to the United States, he did an interview, and he said, I was over in England, and he said, some guy told me I was going to die on February 3rd, so that was kind of spooky. That's what Buddy Holly said. Well, February 3rd, 1959, Buddy Holly was killed in a plane crash.
And Joe Meek knew it, which indicates that, he was connected to the occult, but maybe a little too connected. He got to the stage where it was starting to be dangerous.
Well, it was. And then when this happened, then Joe Meek started to do seances. And who was his writing partner? Jeff Goddard, I believe. And they had actually contacted Buddy Holly in the afterlife, according to Joe Meek. And he had written a song called A Tribute to Buddy Holly that Mike Berry did. Mike Berry and the Outlaws. And when the song was played for the spiritual presence, according to Meek, the message came, see you on the charts. Because he wanted to make sure it was a good taste that Buddy Holly would agree. So then there were rumors that Joe Meek and his partner Jeff Goddard were actually writing songs with dead rock stars. And that hit the newspaper. So more and more it got into the occult.
And of course, these days, that's the kind of thing that gets into the British tabloid press very easily. The Daily Star, The Sun, over in the US, the National Enquirer. But we're talking about a previous era, decades and decades ago, where that kind of stuff did not get out so readily.
Oh no, and it wasn't looked upon as favorably, And but this happened, and it seems like Joe Meek spent a lot of time at what's the famous cemetery with the Highgate Cemetery.
Highgate's where Karl Marx is buried, yeah.
Yeah, and that he would take recorders and he would try to tape spiritual presences in the cemetery, that he belonged to the London Academy of Psychic Studies. And he got so further into this that Ritchie Blackmore's wife at the time, Marguerite, I guess, said that she was convinced that he was possessed by the spirit of Aleister Crowley, she believed, because this was the occult guru of the whole period.
Well, he was the original magic man, wasn't he?
He was, and Meek had shaved his head. Meek was convinced that there were listening devices all through his studio, and they actually found some bugs. I mean, that's what's strange. And
so who would have been bugging if I didn't know that? I knew that Meek was obsessed with this idea that he was being bugged. I didn't know they found some.
They actually did. But I think it goes to this. Do you remember an event in English history that was called the Suitcase Murders?
Yeah.
Okay, what had happened is that Joe Meek had been arrested for solicitation. And they found this body that had been dismembered and placed in 2 large suitcases. And the body was identified as this young man that Joe Meek had known. So the police were very interested to see if Joe Meek had been involved in this murder. I mean, I'm pretty sure that wasn't the case, but that would sort of give you an idea that somebody was investigating you at the end. And that and everything else probably pushed Joe Meek over the end. And when his landlady came that day, she goes upstairs, and one of his assistants is downstairs, and he hears a shotgun blast, and he sees the landlady falling down the stairs with her back still smoldering from the buckshot. He rushes up, and then Joe Meek takes his own life. Now, he kills himself on February 3rd.
But
the anniversary of Buddy Holly's death.
But, his mind, the balance of his mind, as they say, the technical term for it, the balance of his mind was disturbed. Perhaps he was planning to do something on that day.
Maybe that was it. Maybe that was the whole date that he had locked it in together. But Phil Spector also carried guns in the studio. Joe Meek had actually taken a pistol when Tom Jones and the Senators were recording for him. He takes a pistol and puts it right in Tom Jones's face and pulls the trigger, and the gun goes off, and it was loaded with blanks. Terrified Tom Jones. When Mitch Mitchell was recording in the studio, Mitch was always known to overplay. I mean, he's not a simple drummer. And Joe Meek would come running out screaming at him, play it simple, and he'd go back in and Mitch would play what he wanted to play. And then finally, Joe Meek comes out with that same shotgun, and he points it at Mitch Mitchell and he says, I said, play softly. So Mitch Mitchell played the way Joe Meek wanted to play that day. So those guns were used in the studio. But let's go back full circle. Phil Spector was arrested for a murder that occurred in his home in Southern California. I was in Los Angeles that day, and I was flying back, and when I picked up the paper, he was arrested on February 3rd.
Wow. I must stop saying wow, but this stuff is so connected. If you wanted to make a great conspiracy theory about all of it, you certainly could.
Well, you could. I mean, I know it's coincidental, but I mean, even if it's a coincidence, you still have those chills that go up your spine when you see that, and if you have the information that it was February 3rd. And I think one thing that got me into this, Howard, was in the United States, the Lincoln penny came out, and there were rumors that all these events that came out that linked Lincoln to John Kennedy, and there were like 25 of them. And every time you'd read it, like their both vice presidents were named Johnson.
And they both they both had a secretary with the same name.
Yeah,
but
Lincoln
hasn't a lot
and
of this stuff been dismissed as sort of urban myth?
Well, some of it has, but when it came out originally, people normally accept it. What I do is I'm interested in finding out when did this event occur. If it occurred on February 3rd and it involved something that had a Buddy Holly link, then maybe it's a little bit more than coincidence, But
it is amazing how all these people, Buddy Holly is a common factor, a common theme in all of them, and yet Buddy Holly himself, as you said, was not a man who was particularly connected to the occult like Joe Meek was, but there seems to have been something around or about him, if we follow this train of thought,
or it's just the idea that
sucked people in.
Yeah, maybe the idea is to be careful what you wish for.
Because you might get it at the end.
Yeah,
that's a
it's
frightening
like
thing.
Alexander the Great. If you remember, Alexander the Great had said that Zeus Ammon had appeared before him and offered him two choices. He could have a short life filled with fame, or he could live to be an old man and never know fame. And he chose the short life. And he died at 33. So if it goes all the way back into ancient classical history, who knows?
What about Mark Bolan? What do you know about him?
Well, just a great performer, very talented with T-Rex. When he was killed, of course he died too young. We could say that about everyone else. But when his car smashed into the tree, when the police got there, they found a badge that had fallen out on the seat, and it said, "Every day is a Holly day." Holly.
And he again was somebody who loved Buddy Holly. But from what I hear, he was also very much of the mind that he would be killed in a car crash. Didn't he used to tell people that?
Yes, he did. And you know what's really strange? A number of rock artists have claimed that they'd never lived to see 30. Janis Joplin said, "I'll never live to be 30." She was right. She died at 27. Ronnie Van Zant in the group Leonard Skinner told his mother and father, he said, "I'll never live to see 30." And he was killed, I think, either 28 or 29. Eric Clapton never expected to see 30. Jimmy Page never expected to see 30, but they did. And I think they were well grounded in the Robert Johnson myth, because both those guitarists were major fans of Robert Johnson. And they knew he died at a very early age. And I think that's what sort of shook them. So I think that a lot of rock and roll stars, they know it. I read an article in the United States with John Mayer. And in the article, John Mayer said, he said, "I tell you that my greatest accomplishment," he said, "I passed 27. And that's what John Mayer said. So, I mean, these are new artists. But I guess they've read my book and they know the thing about the 27 thing. But all of them are saying, I'm past 27 now.
So if you're a musician, if you're in music and you're listening to this now and you happen to be 26 and 11 months, get it all into perspective, okay? This doesn't happen to everybody.
That's right. Do not play your electric guitar in a bathtub. Stay out of small planes.
Not a good idea. Make sure you play safe, as they say.
Work from home for a year. Home recording. That's the way to go.
Well, who knows about that? I don't know. But these stories are so fascinating. And the Joe Meek thing in particular has always fascinated me because I'm interested in recording, and the guy designed electronics. I'm using some of it right now that 40 years on we're still amazed by and we're still using, and there's nothing quite like it. But you would have thought that if anybody was going to communicate from beyond the grave, it would be somebody like him.
Oh, you'd think so. Maybe someone's not contacted him yet. So.
Do we know of any rock stars who have regularly made appearances from the other side?
Well, let's see. When I do Coast to Coast, I know that there's a lot of information that comes through. I know that there were seances involving John Lennon, and I think it was even a pay-per-view event, but I mean, I think that pretty well fell flat on its face. I know that when I was talking to another, probably a mutual friend of ours, you know Bill Harry.
Tell me.
Liverpool, who created Mercy Beat magazine.
Oh, yes, I do. I was being dense, yeah.
Yeah, well, Bill's a good friend of mine, and he was telling me that if you remember John Lennon, he said that one of his quotes was that if there was anything to the afterlife, that he told his son Julian that he would make a white feather float, so to watch for the white feather. Well, Cynthia Lennon was telling Bill that when Julian's career took off and he was playing the Royal Albert Hall, that he was very nervous, and a package came that very day. And when they opened the package, it was an American Indian headdress that had been stolen from John Lennon when the Beatles had come to the United States. And when the package was opened, these beautiful white feathers came floating into the air.
Ooh. And since then, Julian Lennon has become involved. I know this because I saw a DVD that he's in the process of making. I don't think it's been released yet. I might be wrong about that. But he's involved in a lot of new age things these days.
Yes, he is. And his mother said that really gave him the confidence to go out that night and perform. So that's it. And Bill, being a very good friend of John Lennon's, has had a number of psychics trying to get to him to tell him that Lennon's trying to get in touch with him. So we're going to wait and see how that works out. So it seems like John Lennon may be very well active, according to a lot of people. And of course, you know, I'm sure a lot of this is bogus, but still have only one chance. Who knows?
You know, John Lennon was,
interesting.
Being a Liverpudlian and having been very small during the Beatles era, but certainly being aware of it, even as like a 3-4-year-old boy, you couldn't fail to be aware of it. But John Lennon was such a strong character. You would feel that if anybody could come back from the other side, if there is another side, then he would. And certainly, with all the stuff that's going on in the world at the moment, with the subprime mortgage crisis and political instability here, there, and everywhere, and are we going to contact extraterrestrials and all the rest of it, if we needed anybody's view on all of this, we need his.
And that's true. And of course, as you said, John Lennon was very fascinated with the cult. I remember reading in Patty Harrison or Patty Boyd's book, Wonderful Tonight, she talked about a seance she attended with John and Cynthia and George, where this couple in Great Britain had promised to get some message to John from the afterlife, and that there were going to be 2 people from the planet Venus there. So they all show up.
Okay.
Then they announced that the Venetians could not be there, and they were very disappointed. So they sort of chuckled to each other. But, I mean, they were always interested. And, of course,